First flight of the orbiter Discovery, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Hey, welcome to the Health or High Water podcast. As always, host Brett here with Mr. Trip the Parks. Hey, thank you guys for joining us. It's been a fantastic ride. We hope you're having a wonderful day. Want to give a shout out to a couple of sponsors. First of all, Laguna's Coffee, the best in the business. Thank you so much. Local to Denver also. So, give them some support. Check out their website. We appreciate them being involved in what we do.
Don't forget our clothes sponsor, U. Shout out to Kenny. If you guys want any clothes from them, go to Instagram and type U and check out awesome clothes that are going to be all over the place pretty soon.
Yes, and as well, Gene Planet, our genetic sponsors, which have done a fantastic job for us. So, again, thank you to Gene Planet.
And thank you to the listeners, too. Thank you guys so much. We got some new states out there, Nebraska, Oregon, and France is coming up with one of the top...
France,
dude.
We.
Yeah.
All right.
That Belgium. So we're hitting up in the European market.
With no more ado, Mr. Robert Allison, good sir, how are you? Pull that microphone just a touch closer. You might have to.
Here, let me help you out.
You might have to do the little squiggle. How are you doing today? How's your day going?
Day is fantastic. I'm doing great.
We have Robert Allison in here. So he's doing a lot of stuff. We've had a lot of people on the podcast. We wanted to have you on. Your background is pretty heavy on the mental health. Like a lot
Sure.
of what you're doing is mental health. You're working with depression, anxiety, trauma, substance abuse. You're working with families. So a lot of these like mental health issues. Can you just give our listeners a quick background of kind of what you're doing right now and some of the credentials that you have?
Yeah, I'm a licensed counselor here in the state of Colorado. So it's heavy on mental health. It's been pretty exclusively mental health. I was fortunate. I took a Psych 101 class in high school. I've always been a curious guy, and I was curious about that. I've always been interested in human behavior, and it stuck. So I went to did my undergrad in psychology, went to grad school for counseling, psychotherapy, and psychology. And I've always been interested in it. So I've done inpatient work. I've done outpatient work. Done crisis work. So I've done a little bit of everything.
What do you and now that is your full time. You're working with you have your client list. Like, what are you in like a facility of your own? How does that work?
I have my own private practice here in Denver. I've been doing that for about 5 years now. Special focus in my practice now, working with men's mental health. Probably about 5 years ago, around the time I started my practice, I was looking for referrals and noticed that it was mainly men that were calling me. I'd worked in agencies in the past. Kind of the demographics with therapists and therapy clients, they skew very, very female. I forget the exact percentages off the top of my head, but majority of therapists are female, majority of patients are female. Realized a lot of guys were calling me, and that was the majority of the referrals I was getting, so I was leaning into it a little bit. Looked at some statistics around men. Some I find kind of chilling. They haven't changed a lot over the years. Men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide. Not attempt suicide, not think about it, but 3 times more likely to die by suicide. Couple that with the fact that they are half as likely to be diagnosed with depression. Again, I thought that was pretty scary. Also on the personal side, around that time, I just had my first son. I have 2 boys. So I was also kind of working into that transition of being a father and thinking about my role as a man and my experience as a man in the world and things I want to impart to my son. So kind of got it from both ends and decided that was what I was going to lean into.
Yeah, and how is that right now? You're working with a lot of different types of people, I'm sure, right? Like from everywhere from depression to maybe like some stuff at family at home. Is there one way you're leaning right now, like that or is just, hey, whatever this client needs, I'm going to address that? Like how's that work?
It's a little more the latter. I'd say if I'm going to pick probably the top 2 categories I come across, it's anxiety and depression. I've done a lot of trauma work in the past. My personal perspective these days, I don't think we define trauma very well in our culture, because if you really look at the clinical definition of it, it's pretty narrow, it's pretty restricting, and I think, quite frankly, there's a lot of traumatic things that happen in life. I would go out on a limb. I think anybody that, I think we all have trauma in our life. I think any therapy client everywhere, they've got some trauma in their background. And
it's a certain degree, right, of what that trauma is, but to everyone that might be the worst thing that's ever happened to them. versus somebody else, right?
Yeah, sometimes clinically we break it down a little informally. There's kind of a capital T trauma and a lowercase trauma, and capital T's being the more traditional things. You've had some serious threat to your life. It's a sexual assault. Somebody close to you has had some life-threatening injury, or you witness that. The lowercase ones, I think they can kind of fly under the radar. Believe it or not, I talk to a lot of clients, and they are well into adulthood, but we talk about early things like bullying in school, or early experiences, or just things with their parents that weren't outright abusive or neglectful, but they leave a mark.
What's your thoughts on depression? So everybody is bound to be sad from time to time, right? Like they go through a friend dies, which happens to all of us, or whatever it is as life comes at us. We're dealing with a ton of stuff, and we're bound to have these times. Where do you, as a professional in your field, where do you draw that line depression-wise, as far as hey, these are normal things you're going through. You're not, clinically depressed. You're supposed to be sad. Where's that line for you, and how do you kind of negotiate that with clients?
Yeah, lines. I could go in a bunch of different directions with this, and I'll try not to get too in the weeds and too clinical with it.
Our list. The whole point of this podcast is take this where we want. We want to have these good conversations that bring up more questions.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, if I get too in the weeds, you guys can pull me back a little bit. And so, there's a clinical depression, and it's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, DSM. A lot of people are familiar with that term, and if you Google it, you can bring it up really quick. And it's been through I think they're on the 5th version now, or maybe the 5th version with a text revision. I think depression in particular is interesting because the criteria have kind of expanded around it over years. And there's some insurance factors at play, because if you're going to use your private insurance to get therapy, they have to give you a diagnosis. And so if you have that diagnosis, it's not a conspiracy, not my personal conspiracy theory. You can look at how they've changed over the years, and so there's a little bit to it. They've gotten a little bit more ambiguous over the years. So if you're talking, 40 years ago, clinical depression was very narrow. It was a very small percentage of the population, and that expanded in the 4th version, expands even more in the 5th version. I'm not opposed to it. I think it's a good idea because a big part of that is more people are going to get services now. Insurance is a big thing for people to be able to use that to pay for mental health services. Makes it easier. I've got no problem with that at all whatsoever. One issue I would take away from it is sometimes it pathologizes I lost somebody, I'm sad. That is a perfectly normal reaction to something that happens in life. And I think we can get ourselves into trouble when we pathologize it. If I were to go out on a limb, very rarely do I have a client that has real, true clinical depression these days. Does it happen? Sure. But I'd say I generally on my caseload, I have about 40, 45 people at any given time. It's maybe 1 or 2 of them that really hit that clinical threshold. The other, 40 to 43 people that are there, we do valuable work. They have real issues that we are working through. But yeah, it's kind of how do I work my way through these depressive feelings?
That's perfect. Great answer. Sorry.
No, man. So one thing I've always noticed too, and we experience this all the time in health and wellness, is that the textbooks cannot keep up with the real world data. Right?
For sure.
By the time the textbook comes out, it's already moot. Right?
Especially now.
For sure.
Especially now. Things are moving quick now.
So, in your process of learning and diagnosis, all this stuff, where do you follow the line between the text and just real world application? Because this information is not coming out quick enough. Yeah. Anxiety, depression, any sort of mental health condition, I really view it more as a process than a diagnosis or a series of symptoms. And that's arguably the biggest gripe I have with it is, right, you look at a textbook, you look at the DSM, you look at the clinical criteria and the symptoms, and they are a snapshot in time of a population. And if you apply it to that person, it's a snapshot in time in that person's life. And you do a lot of living over the course of a year, over the course of a decade, over the course of your lifetime. And so it is, helpful in categorizing what I see in front of me here. It's not real helpful in explaining how you got here, and it's not necessarily helpful in explaining how you get out of it. And so really my perspective and going through depression and the process of that is it's not just these symptoms on a piece of paper. It isn't just feeling sad. There are emotions that are involved in it. There are behaviors that are involved in it. There are thoughts that are involved in it. How do we look at that entire process, get a little bit of information about how you got here and how you got to this point in this process and in your life, and then we use that to figure out how do we get you out of it? How do we figure out how to take some of these behaviors off of autopilot and find healthier, more adaptive ones?
Yeah, so you're working with, it sounds like a partnership almost in a sense. does it feel like a partnership, or is it more like, do you have the, I'm the professional, and there's nothing wrong with having that. Sometimes that's needed to let somebody know, like, hey, I know what I'm doing. Like, let me take you through this. How's that? Give me some, and our listeners, some perspective on that dynamic, client-patient, and how that works.
Yeah, it's got to be collaborative. I absolutely view it as a partnership.
Right.
And sometimes people will walk in, they say, look, you're the expert, you got the letters behind your name, I'm paying you money, so tell me what to do.
Sure.
And,
sure.
if that's, I want to meet somebody where they're at. So if that's what they're looking for, I don't think that's going to get us everywhere we need to go. But if that's where we start, then fine. We'll work on more concrete, tactical things. And because also part of the therapy relationship is, I think it's kind of weird because it requires a lot of trust. And it requires somebody coming into my office talking about very candid, very vulnerable, very intimate things. And I am a total stranger.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a professional relationship, but I'm a total stranger. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of work to build that trust, build that sort of rapport so that it does get to be a partnership. Because at the end of the day, we use words and we use language to convey things, but talking about emotions, talking about our internal experience, it's hard. It's really difficult to put it into words. It's really difficult to make sense of on our own, let alone convey that to somebody else. And that's information I need to be able to give them the sort of guidance that they're going to need to get where they want to go.
Yeah, no, framed so well. I want to kind of move into from depression into anxiety. So I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like anxiety has almost gotten, either it's more talked about now or it's more prevalent than ever, especially social anxiety, right? Like I meet a lot of people that, especially it could be a client or anybody that just have this overwhelming anxiety, whether it be in their friendships or at work, or, oh my God, I'm public speaking. That's normal. I'm assuming that's a normal thing, right? Like I want to present myself well.
Yeah.
What are when somebody comes to you and they're like, I'm having this crippling anxiety every day. How do you approach that, and what are some tools you're using to start to help improve that, or something that you've seen that I know this has worked?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is talked about more. And if I were to venture a guess, I would agree with that perspective. I think there is more of it these days. And not necessarily that the world is scarier and a worse place or it's more dangerous. And some of those things are true in some regards. But in a sense, I think there's a lot more to be anxious about. And I'm not anti-social media. I'm not against the internet. I'm 41, so I grew up in an interesting time where I went to high school. The internet was just coming about when I was in high school. So I definitely remember a world way before social media, before the internet. But the thing about it is all these things to worry about, to feel anxious about, to compare yourself to, they can be front and center every day when it comes to that. Public speaking, social anxiety, they tend to be top of the list. Oftentimes people will put public speaking above death in terms of fears.
I think it is above death. People are like, I'd rather die than public speaking.
You die, it's over. And so in public speaking, there's a fear of embarrassment and rejection and those things. And I think how you view anxiety and how you view your internal response to anxiety, I think is the most important part. And anxiety, it's meant to be protective in nature. And so it's meant to get your guard up a little bit, get your alarm up a little bit. Often if you're going to put yourself in front of a crowd or anything that you want to do that has some importance, you care about it. And if you care about it and there is a threat or a risk of failure, there's a chance you might fail, that's one area where anxiety really comes in. So if I want to go out and I want to speak and I put myself in front of other people, I want to do well. And if there's a chance I don't, that's where that anxiety comes in. It can be really useful, can be motivating. It was for me all throughout my undergrad and grad school. If I had to give a presentation, if I had a paper to do, if I had a test to do, there's a little bit of anxiety that comes with that because I want to do well. And I can look at that anxiety because I care about this thing and I can use that. I can study, I can prepare. The catch with it is, though, just because I do those things, that anxiety doesn't go away. And that's kind of the other side of the coin, is there's no guaranteed, reliable way to eliminate it. And I don't think you would want to, because it's part of the human experience. It's part of the human condition.
Yeah.
It's a survival tool,
I used to,
sure.
This was the weirdest thing, anxiety related. So when I used to wrestle in high school,
used to wrestle.
I don't know, 100 matches maybe throughout my career, but before every single match, my skin would start to show, it would draw really cold, and then I'd see these red lines across my skin every time. It was like this surge of adrenaline, like fighter, this every single match. Didn't matter if I knew I was going to crush the person. I was like, anxiety is a powerful thing. It starts.
Yeah.
It starts like almost like in your brain, and then it becomes physiological.
Yeah.
So then it really does have those physiological effects. So
Well, I do got kind of like a two-part question. The first part is like you're seeing people all over social media freaking out all the time now. You know, like they're all anxious, they're worked up, they're in like flight or fight mode all the time. Is it because of the society that we're living in? This anxiety is coming out, you think, or is it just us evolving as a culture?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I want to just tie back to what Brett just said a moment ago. Again, anxiety being a process. Yeah, there's this mental aspect of it. There's a physical aspect of it. There's an emotional aspect of it. It's that whole thing.
yeah.
And I think there's definitely an evolutionary root to it. And there's what was it? I think Teddy Roosevelt has a quote that I love. Comparison is the thief of joy. I think I'm getting that correctly.
Love that quote.
Yeah, and you know,
Totally.
and that's something of the evolutionary aspect. If you think about it, you know, centuries ago when the world was a more dangerous place, resources were more scarce. I mean, you needed to rely on other people. You needed to rely on a tribe, a culture, a community, and if you are cast out of that, I mean, that's certain death. So there is this evolutionary quality of fitting in. Because I need to fit in, I need to earn my keep here, and if I don't, then that could have literal life and death consequences for me. Society, obviously, much different these days. You know, there's not necessarily being cast out in a way that you are just wandering the wilderness and you're going to freeze and starve to death. But you can look at social media and those parts in the back of our brain that haven't evolved as quickly as the frontal lobes, you know, it just kind of hammers on them with how am I measuring up? And if you look at social media, people tend not to post, I think, the most vulnerable, most intimate, most honest captions and pictures on there. It's a lot of what's awesome and what's going well and this killer brunch I just had and all these awesome things I'm doing. And so it's really easy to look at that and think, oh, shit, I'm not measuring up. I'm falling behind. I've got to do something about this. And, you know, that generally speaking goes one of two ways. I need to perform more. I need to accomplish more. I need to do more. I need to put myself out there. I need to come up. Or I can just withdraw and I can avoid and I can kind of opt out of things.
Well, and the second part here is going into men's health, just men's mental health a lot. I know the past even 5-6 years, it's starting to become a concern. You know, we're not taught. Men's mental health isn't talked about a ton, especially with soldiers and all this kind of stuff. So,
For sure.
what do you think is the biggest issue with mental health right now, and how can we solve that down the road?
Man, that is a tricky question.
It's a hard one.
Especially the last part. How do we solve
He's
it?
like, how do we get world peace, Robert?
Yeah. You guys have any ideas? I'm all ears. You know, I think
It's a good question.
the first part of it is having a more honest conversation, which I think we do more of. I think this is interesting, and this is a little bit of inside baseball, and I think the general population isn't aware of this, but the American Psychological Association, they give a lot of guidelines and treatment guidelines for clinical populations. And there's one for multicultural populations, there's one for women. There was not one for men, I think, until 2014 or 2016.
Wow. Interesting.
And again, if you really think about the history of therapy, it was a lot of kind of old white men treating women was predominantly where it started. And so it kind of shaped and evolved that way. And other people have come in that, this being specific for white women, or not necessarily specific for white women, but kind of trending that way a little bit. It doesn't necessarily work for different populations, for Black women, Hispanic women. So I think it's interesting that the guidelines for men, which I have my quibbles with, and they're not great, they're good. It's something, it's a starting point. But yeah, I think it's interesting that they only came about in the last 5 or 6 years, I think it has been. Terry Real is a therapist. He wrote a book called I Don't Want to Talk About It. I think it came out in 1996, and to my knowledge, that's the first book that really specifically referenced depression from a male perspective. And yeah, there's a lot of overlap, and there's a certain just human experience that comes with depression, but men experience emotions differently. They express emotions differently. I think the absolute top of that list is anger. I can't even tell you how many referrals I've gotten for quote unquote anger management, and I continue to get, and pretty much 0% of that time has it been just purely anger. And it's not a guarantee that, if you're struggling with anger and you get frustrated, that there's an underlying depression, but that's one way depression comes out that is a very masculine way for it to come out. And what we do about it, I mean, man, that's a tricky one. And I think it is, I think a lot of it is men having open, vulnerable conversations with other men. Kind of conversations where three dudes talking about mental health here.
100%.
And, I know the generation I grew up in, and nothing against my father. He's a great guy, but having, real deep, emotional, vulnerable conversations around mental health. Yeah, it really wasn't. There was a lot of don't cry about it. There's a lot of suck it up. And, the sucking it up aspect, it's got a point in life, but I mean, it's a tool to be used. And I think that's a big part of it, is making sure that men have other tools other than stoicism, other than sucking it up, other than just kind of stuffing emotions and not expressing them.
That's interesting. And interesting you mentioned stoicism too at the end. I have a lot of Scandinavian and Finnish in my family, and we're, innately have kind of like a stoic, and I definitely have that, where I don't show emotion almost ever. Like I'm very, I typically don't talk about, and I grew up in the same generation as you did, where it's like, as men, you're not depressed, you're not sad, suck it up. Even if you're injured, you hide it. And there's some great to that. I'm not saying it's all good. There's some great to being a man but now we're starting to see these, like Tripp said, you're starting to see like almost this wave of people that are like, hey, there needs to be an outlet. You mentioned soldiers as well, which is close to all of our hearts right now. Is like, as Americans, like, we need to especially focus on especially the soldiers and the people who have taken care of us and given us the liberties that we have. But they're just an example of how do we open up? How do we approach that? Somebody comes to you, it's got to be a process, right? Like, this isn't something they're doing on the first session with you.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
Definitely. I mean, it's definitely a rarity where somebody comes in and they kind of spill their guts and this is everything and we're going to put it all out there. We're going to pick through it. And that's awesome. But that's not where most people are. I think there is this sort of natural apprehension that comes when you're walking in. And, that's, again, not get too jargony with you guys, but there's this idea of what we refer to as a therapeutic window. And this is kind of, you're uncomfortable enough to get into some things and get some benefit from it, but it's not overshooting that window where this is overwhelming and this is too much emotion, this is too much anxiety, this is touching on things that are too intense, and so I'm going to shut down and I'm going to back off. And if you undershoot that window, then you're not really doing any work. We can talk about the weather and baseball, and here's this frustrating conversation I have, but it's not really moving the needle. And so, it's a process of really calibrating that and figuring out where that is. And that window, you can progressively move up to more and more intense things as you get through it. Then you can expand that window to incorporate more things. But there's some calibration that goes with that.
I think about that as sort of like a level, my personal life, as a level of friends that I have and a level of acquaintances or associates. And I always find, and let me know your thoughts on this if this sounds right clinically. There's a lot of people I don't tell anything to, and I'm strong for them, right? There's nothing, and then I usually have like one or two people, or like one person where I'm kind of vulnerable to, right? Like where I'll be weak for. I'm like, man, I'm feeling this, because we don't talk about our feelings. Is that's healthy? Is that like kind of what you suggest? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the short answer, I think that's definitely healthy. And I did a workshop years ago, and I gotta see if I can remember the details, because it spoke very much to that. And I think he had us draw 3 circles, and it was, think about as many people in your life as you can, and I want you to put an X in each one of these circles to represent these people you can think of. And I think the outermost circle these are people that when you see them, you give them a handshake. And that's as close as it gets. The people on the circle, the next circle in, these are people that you'll give them a hug, you'll maybe give them a kiss on the cheek. And, there's a little more than that outer circle, but that's as far as it gets. And the people on the innermost circle, like, these are people that you would give a really warm embrace to, or you'd give a kiss on the lips to. And I think it really speaks to that. And across the board, everybody had a lot of X's in the outermost circle, less on the middle circle, and then usually only a couple on the innermost circle. And I mean, if I'm thinking about my life, I mean, the people that I am really intimate with, it's my wife and it's my 2 kids, and maybe 1 or 2 friends that I'm really, really close with that we talk about anything. In that middle circle for me, I've got a bunch of people that we can get a little bit deeper, but there's a bit of a limit to that. And then, a lot of people in that outermost circle where yeah, we have a good time, but there's kind of boundaries and parameters to what we're going to talk about. And we're all entitled to boundaries, and I think they're healthy and they are essential in life.
Sure.
And it takes a lot of work and energy to be intimate and vulnerable with other people. And, and so, that's something to be protected at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, especially as a man too,
Yeah.
with all the way we all grew up, hey, shut up, get going and keep moving.
Yeah.
You see a lot of problems with that, especially with men opening up because we don't feel like we're allowed to, right?
Yeah.
So what are
big
some
time.
things like, let's say I'm going through something, what are some things I could do to help myself open up and learn to express these emotions healthily?
The biggest thing, the way I break it down with a lot of people, and I think generally speaking, guys, we like to live kind of neck up in our head. There's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of rationality, there is a lot of logic, and that can be great. And I am not, and for a lot of people, that is an important part of their masculinity, and I'm not trying to talk anybody out of that. But we also have an entire experience from the neck down. There's a lot of things that go on in our body. That's generally speaking, if we're going to, pick a place where we feel emotions, tends to be somewhere from the neck down. And I think that's an excellent starting point for really anybody, and I think men in particular, is really thinking about what your neck down experience is. So if I'm engaged in a conversation, there's something going on, not just kind of recycling and processing and mulling through these thoughts, but what is the rest of this experience? I have a particular thought. Is there a particular emotion that comes up with this? Is there a particular physical sensation that comes around with this?
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I kind of picture, and this goes back to a different podcast we had too, picture like the body, and again, I'm saying this because I want to know your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
I picture the body as like a tree or a layer of onions, and trauma or like bad things that are stress, very traumatic events, kind of like stay within us in a sense. It almost feels like after years of not dealing with this stuff, like we have to kind of unpeel these things and go, who am I as a person, and finding a way to have a mechanism every day to reset ourselves, to flush ourselves out and to reset and go. Tripp and I had a great conversation the other day where we did that, and we're just like, hey, let's restart over. Is that something you practice? Have you done that yourself? Does that make sense to you at all?
Love it. I do try to practice that myself, and there's actually an analogy I've only come across in recent years, and it was comparing kind of mental health to athletes. And if you look at high-performing pro-level athletes, if football, it's NFL season right now, they play a game once a week, practice a bunch of times during the week. They are spending exponentially more time recovering, stretching, ice baths, that kind of stuff, whatever an NFL player is going to do to recover outside of that. They spend a small amount of their time really performing at the absolute highest level, going out there at 100%. I think emotions and mental health can be the same way. If I'm going to have a really deep, intimate conversation, you just simply do not have the capacity on an emotional level, a cognitive level, a neuroscience level to be in that state 100% of the time. Take something out of you, and you have to build in recovery somewhere in your schedule, in an emotional, in a cognitive, in a mental health sort of way. My personal practice, and it always kind of changes and evolves. I told you guys before we recorded, I have 2 little kids at home. They're 7 and they're 10. So, a lot of my home life revolves around getting them where they need to go in school. And I wish my morning routine were different, but they've got to get up, they've got to get the bus early. So that takes priority in it. The one thing I could find is I can easily, I use that term relatively, build in 5 minutes in my morning that's just silence, and that's time for meditation and mindfulness. And my mindfulness practice is super simple. I set a timer for 5 minutes. As much as I can, I have silence in my house. This is after my kids leave and my wife is either working or she is gone. So I've got 5 minutes of silence, and I focus on my breath for 5 minutes. And that's a great primer for me for the rest of the day, because all the swirling, I'm a chronic overthinker myself. And so it's just, and I give a couple caveats with mindfulness, a couple myths I always like to dispel. It's not about silencing your mind. It's not about quieting your mind, forcing that willfully to do it. It's not necessarily about relaxing. Those can be byproducts of it. But for me, I focus on my breath, and my mind starts to chatter and it pulls me away, and I acknowledge that and I bring it back to my breath.
I'm so sad I have to leave this conversation. I have a session. I gotta go. I gotta be super rude. So sorry. Boo, Brett. Robert, hey, pleasure chatting with you, man.
Pleasure to meet you.
So good. Sorry, you guys. I gotta go train, but
Loser.
See you later.
Well, I hope you're okay with just me here.
For sure.
I want to talk a little bit about the word toxic masculinity and where it plays a part right now. I know, I'm going to speak for myself right now, is I don't feel like I can be a man right now in today's society, what I was taught to be. And I feel chastised for, hey, like toxic masculinity, if you like football, you like sports, like being that guy, it's like you're a bad guy, quote unquote, right? Yeah. So where does that live in our place, and what's healthy and what's not healthy about using this term?
Yeah, I personally, I'm on board with the spirit that I think is behind, at least as I understand it, toxic masculinity. I don't like the term though, because I just don't think anything about a person is toxic. People can engage in toxic behaviors and do toxic things, but there's nothing inherently toxic about people. And yeah, I think there can be this kind of conflating between more traditional masculine traits and things that men gravitate towards, and that getting conflated with those things are toxic, which again, it's really how men voice those things and how they treat other people and how they engage in them is what qualifies it as toxic or not. And I don't think it's really a helpful term, because it doesn't give anybody a roadmap for how to get out of it or what to do differently. I think the biggest issue with masculinity right now is too rigidly adhering to certain values and certain norms that were maybe thrust upon you and that you don't personally identify with. So yeah, you're a sports fan, you like football, I like football too. I had this conversation with a buddy of mine, like, on a Sunday, like I sit down, I have a beer and I watch football, and there's something that, it's just, and well, yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if I'm doing that and I'm yelling at my wife and I'm neglecting my kids, and, that Sunday when I have to go to work the next day, it turns into a dozen beers and then I'm hungover, those are toxic things. But if that's something I just enjoy and I personally feel a particular masculine energy around that, there's nothing wrong with that. And, on the other side of it, if you don't endorse those things, that's fine too. And I think the biggest thing is helping guys flexibly figure out what those roles are for them. And just really at the end of the day, I don't think shaming anybody about anything is just not an effective way to change behavior. And because when you shame people, and I mean, they've done a lot of research around this, and try not to get too jargony yet again with all of it. But actually, I'll forget that, because that gets way in the weeds and it gets jargony.
No, go for it, man.
But shaming is not an effective way to change behavior. Shaming only gets people to avoid that shaming stimuli. And so if you're going to shame somebody, again, little kids. So I think of things in terms of fatherhood and little kids. And, if you yell at kids or you punish them or you take things away, there's a role for those things. But it's, really thinking about what it is that you are doing with that, because kids are going to learn, well, I did this thing, I said this thing, and dad yelled at me, and I don't like being yelled at, and that's what he always does. So I don't necessarily learn the lesson that dad is trying to impart. I just figure out how to not get dad to yell at me. So I'm going to figure out what those things are to avoid yelling, to avoid shame, and I'll do whatever the hell I want anyways. I think having really open, humanizing, empathic conversations with people and around masculinity, I think that's what moves the needle. And I think it gives men the kind of the space they need to figure out what those roles are, and if they want to take on those traditional roles, or if they want to push back against them or expand them on their own terms.
Well, that was a great answer. That's way better than I. Yeah, that was amazing. And the reason being is too, it's like you almost feel shamed for celebrating being a man nowadays.
Yeah.
There's no Men's Appreciation Month. There's, Father's Day is the only kind of thing that men have that's kind of celebrated, right?
Sure.
So I had to ask that question. I'm just like, there's a place for it. And what I'm getting is like, hey, like just try to be a better man overall. Don't do those. Try not to do those negative things that impact it. And there's nothing wrong with having a beer with your buddies and feeling like a man.
Yeah.
I do want to kind of transition a little bit into youth a little bit. I know you and I, when we had our pre-interview, we talked a little bit about kids and sports and the mentality that's going around it, and how sports programs are being cut from schools and all this. So what's your kind of your opinion on cutting sports programs and kids' mental health nowadays, when they just got out of COVID a few years ago and they're still having effects of it?
Yeah. But I don't know, probably unsurprising. I think youth sports are great. I think that in a lot of ways, I think there's a social aspect to it. I mean, there's a team aspect to it. I think there's a level of collaboration and teamwork that's hard. You can learn in other areas, but I mean, I think that's, my opinion, arguably the best way to go about it. Yeah, I mean, I think school is important. I mean, I have a master's degree. I definitely value education and academics. But I think there can be kind of a tight mold that you can force kids into in that regard. And I mean, some kids, that's just not what they gravitate towards. They gravitate more towards sports. And sports, if those programs are available and they're open, they're probably going to perform better in other areas as well, because they're engaged in a community, in the school, in a larger whole. I also think sports can be a great field for, learning the kind of things we're talking about previously and throughout this entire conversation about how to manage your emotions, about how to be in those emotions, about how to go out there and have the risk of failure and put yourself out there anyway. I think they're great for learning how to do difficult things. And I get it. There's real world concerns around budgets, and you have to be careful with where you put that money. But yeah, I think they're important things, and I think it's a shame when they go away.
Me too, because I can't tell you how much I learned from coaches being in a community of people trying to progress. You know what I mean? We had a podcast about this earlier. It's about the areas of good ethical communities are dying off. People are going to church less. They're not meeting up with their neighbors as much anymore, right? And I just feel like you're missing that ethical bonding and understanding maturing through these coaches. A lot of coaches are out there to make it's not just about the sports; it's about the kids. Yeah. And I think that these programs being pulled are just are terrible for these kids because they can learn a ton of life lessons they don't get at home.
Yeah. Bear with me a second.
Yeah.
I read an interesting study, and it wasn't about sports, but I'll bring it back there in a second. And it was looking at men and happiness and loneliness later in life. And it was kind of middle-aged, middle-class white men tended to be the least happy and the loneliest. They did not find that with black and brown men in the study. And this wasn't geared towards religion or church or spirituality or anything like that. But the one factor they found is that black and brown men were more likely to be part of a church. And with religion and things like that, there's something to be said for it. But that wasn't their finding, that there was a spiritual. Those things are important, but can be for people. It wasn't about that. It was about the community that went along with it. And when you go to church, there's a built-in community with that. And so that was kind of the theory they came up with, is that having connection to community. And I think sports, and I think that's team, that's a community. My older son started wrestling a couple of years ago, and it was fantastic for him. Talking out of school a little bit, but he's young, and we talk about these things openly. So hopefully when he's 10 years from now, if he listens to this, he doesn't mind me talking about it a little bit. But, he was having a hard time at school, and he's just a spirited kid, and he would roughhouse a lot. So then we came across wrestling, and he was interested in it. So that was fantastic. I thought it was a good fit for him. My wife and I thought it was a good fit for him. So we got him enrolled in wrestling, and it was a great physical activity for him. So he was roughhousing less at school because he can go where it's appropriate and do it and have a great time doing it. He made friends. The coach is great. The coaches are great. So there was a community that he got to be part of, and he just learned some, for lack of a better term, intangible skills around that. A little recently, and I'm 41, so I think I was 38, I started jiu-jitsu, and I wish I started earlier in life, but I run into wrestlers there. And it's always interesting conversations about the lessons that they learned from that, around perseverance, around discipline, that they learned in wrestling, and they were front and center there and on display. And they're things that help them in all areas of life. And I'm talking about wrestling because that's just where I have the most experience right now. Not me personally.
Right.
Too bad Brett had to leave. We could have a whole conversation about that. Yeah, right. But I think that applies to really any team sport, because if you're out there, there's a level of discipline. We're going back to what we were talking about earlier. There's that anxiety that can come up. And I think when it comes to having difficult emotions, doing difficult things, it's a skill that you have to learn. Some of us are better at it out of the gate, but it's a skill that we have to learn and work through in life. And you got to have a why. If I'm going to put out there and I'm going to have the discomfort, I've got to have a why, and that can be short term. I care about this sport. I want to win this game. I want to do well this season. But often what I find with people is whatever their athletic or fitness interests are connects to something larger in life.
For me too, to add on, it's also about putting your energy in a positive place too, right? Like you're saying, your son was roughhousing or whatever, not at places he shouldn't be doing it, but he did it less when he had the energy to put it out in the right place. And I think this, the fact that we're missing these programs and whatnot in schools is that the energy isn't going to the right places.
Yeah.
Right. And especially after COVID. Especially after COVID. But I really hope that we can figure out how to help these kids out and find things like church and sports, just group activities, so they can learn these kind of things.
Yeah. There's a lot of communities, at least where we live. And there's a lot of extracurricular. So, I can find a team for anything in our community. And I also recognize that we're fortunate in that regard because we have those resources and we have that access. And that's not the case for all kids. And for some kids, that's their only option. If the school has a team, I can do it. If they don't, I can't. And, again, some kids, they're academically gifted and they're engaged and they really gravitate towards that part of school. But yeah, those extracurriculars are a great way to keep kids engaged that maybe don't care as much about it, and it can be hard to motivate kids. And again, going back to shame, if you're, the old carrot and the stick analogy,
right?
The stick, it's effective in changing behavior in the short term, but not the long term. The carrot is much more effective in that regard. And so sports, kids get a lot out of it and keep them engaged in other ways.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, the things that I've learned from sports as a kid and the people that I met through it were the ethical bindings that brought me here today.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be sitting here doing this with Fitness and Wellness podcasting if I didn't have the support groups. And my swim team coach is one that got me into college. He wrote a very nice letter. And so, I mean, just to know that other kids don't have that just kills me inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, I got to jiu-jitsu later than, not everybody, but than the typical path with it. And I'm not going to go win worlds. I don't really care about that. It's a great activity for me. But honestly, community is the largest thing I get out of it. And, it's just so important throughout life. And I think the earlier you have those experiences and the earlier you are able to engage in those things, better off you're going to be throughout the lifespan.
Well, and do you agree too, you are the 5 people you hang out with most too? Does that have does that environmental factor have a huge impact?
I don't know. I don't know that I agree with that. I think there's something to it. I don't know how much I buy into it, but it's indisputable that the people you hang out with, they have an influence on you. I mean, everything you come across in the day has an influence on you. So people you spend your time with, yeah, absolutely.
I live my life by that. I was fucking up pretty hard in high school. Pretty bad. I was taking painkillers, stuff like that, and I was hanging around with the wrong crowd.
Yeah.
And my dad's like, "You are the 5 people you hang out with most." And that's all he needed to say to me, and I was like, "I'm gonna stop doing this and get myself to community college and whatnot." But that advice is huge. I mean, if you're hanging out with hoodlums and everybody else, you're probably gonna be doing the same shit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, again, going back to things are a process. And if you're hanging out in a community and with people that just perpetuate these processes and behaviors that aren't going to get you anywhere you want to go, or they're just keeping you stuck, well, obviously you're going to stay stuck.
And I agree. The same thing what we do is when we bring a person in too, it's like, hey, what's your environment like? And a lot of personal trainers don't ask that. It's like, hey, what's your environment like? Do you go to the bar every day? Is it, let's talk about your environments. And people don't talk about that very much,
Yeah.
I think you're just an adult. You can control yourself, and that's not really the case at all.
Yeah. And I'm guilty of this. I ought to do it more. But when it comes to mental health, I mean, there's really some low-hanging fruit. Low-hanging fruit in terms of these are things that anybody can do. If your sleep is relatively good or you're doing things to make it better, if your diet is relatively good and you're doing things to make it better, whatever that means for you, and you're engaged in some level of physical activity, again, whatever that is for you, if you're doing those 3 things, you're going to feel better. Point, fact, period.
No, I agree. I just want to thank you so much for coming on. This is the time we give you a plug, your website, how people can find you. I'll backlink it in the website as well, so anyone who's listening can go check him out. It's been a great conversation, but now it's time to plug yourself, man.
Yeah, I don't have too many plugs. My very creatively named practice is just Robert Allison Counseling. You can go check out my website. It's www.rallisoncounseling.com. You can Google me. I'm easy to find. I got my practice over in Highlands, just outside of Denver. So if you're interested, give me a call. Check it out.
If you guys want him on the podcast, he's been great. This guy's awesome. Make sure you guys book him up. I've had a great conversation with you, and it's stuff that I've wanted to talk about for a while, but didn't feel like this masculinity thing. It's hard to bring up nowadays.
Yeah, it's hard to have honest conversations around it, and I think that's such a shame. And I think there's this sort of conflict with that, and I think that arguably is the way forward for men living more fulfilling lives with more vitality, is just having open, honest conversations. And if there's something comes up and it just gets shouted down or shamed, or you're not supposed to be like this, you're not supposed to be like that. And I mean, men hear enough messages around what you're supposed to be or not supposed to be. Right. And if you can't have open conversations around that, then it's hard.
Well, again, thank you so much for coming in. We had a great conversation. Make sure you guys are clicking in the bio to go check his stuff out. If you guys need help, you guys in Denver, check him out. Have an amazing conversation, and hopefully we'll have you back on sometime, man.
Yeah, you guys are awesome. Likewise, you guys are cool. It was a blast.
Thank you so much, and make sure you guys are going to ascendperformancetraining.com/blog to check out more of stuff we got going on. We also have my book is out. It's on Kindle. It's on Amazon. Health profiling. Make sure you read it. It's kind of vulgar, so make sure your kids don't get a hold of it. It's extremely vulgar. But I was trying to scare people into hey, listen, we're living in an epidemic. Like, let's pull our head out of the sand and what.
I wish I'd known that. I watched my language a little bit.
Oh no, man! But most of all of ours are explicit, and we're actually hosted on a place called babyboomers.org, which is like a silver sneaker support website. And they wanted us as a host on there. We're like, you sure? Like, we cuss every episode. But again, man, thank you so much. Make sure you guys are checking out his stuff, and we will see you later.